We'll read from Deuteronomy chapter 5. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the sins of the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Observe the Sabbath by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you nor your son or your daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, or your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and that it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not set your desire on your neighbor's house or land, his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. This is the word of the Lord. Be seated. Well, since today closes out the 10 Commandments, maybe it was good to hear all of them again. The last one, you shall not covet, and especially beginning, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, the house, the land, a servant, an ox, a donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Coveting is what we like, though. I mean, we spend all of our time being told to want something, and often it comes down to wanting what someone else has. Wanting what someone else has. There are several ways that this shows up. I was trying to think of the most graphic way I could talk about someone wanting what someone else has. And I know there might be something notable about it, but one time we were trying to raise money in Abilene, and one of our wheeler dealer guys showed up, and he said, I know that I pledged this much money. I pledged about $100,000, but I will bring you $300,000 if you'll let me have that $100,000 to make money with. And he couldn't help but tell us what he was going to do. This was back when this was a very new thing, and he was a very the closest he could get to scrupulous was let's just say that. But he said, there are people around who are very near death and need money. And I could buy their life insurance policies and give them cents on the dollar for the value of it. And I promise they won't live long, because I've got people that interview them, and if they have to be above 80, and they have to have a named terminal disease, and they have to have an insurance policy of above a certain amount, and I could bring you more money. We ran out of there as if fire could come from heaven down upon us. Just to think that there's this man skulking around, looking to see if you had a big insurance policy and a bad cold. Maybe I could get your insurance policy. Maybe I could take that value from your family, from your widow. Maybe I could make you a deal. That's real life. That's real life. And people do covet their neighbors' wives and run off and do weird and crazy things. When I've taught in Romans chapter 7, where Paul uses coveting as an example of how the law functions, not only to tell you what is right, but to tell you that you're not right. And he talks about coveting. I always use the example. I didn't even know I wanted my neighbor's bass boat until I saw it. And then I thought maybe that'd be nice. Maybe let me borrow it. Maybe. And then I heard the legalists' take on legalized covetousness. I wish I had his boat and he had a better one. As if somehow that laundered it a little bit. I wish. And I'm not going to say much about this. I know a fellow who had a really good sermon on this, and I wanted it. But at this point, I haven't taken it. But especially in the context of the whole set of the Ten Commandments, there's this sense of learning to rely upon God. Here is God. Here is the Lord. Here is the all caps Lord. And He has done great things for you. The reason you're going to rest on the Sabbath is because you're going to rest and you're going to let your servants rest, because after all, you remember what it was like in Egypt. And it's not related to creation in Deuteronomy, of course. Y'all learned that several chapels ago. But this is related to what God did in the Exodus. And so what God has done around you and for you is helping lead you to a certain kind of life before God. And in Deuteronomy, you don't have that dreadful golden calf episode that you have in Exodus. Because in Exodus, the people who heard the law the first time, they were people had decided not to wait upon the Lord. They had decided that they did not trust the Lord, that they didn't know if Moses would come back. And so they decided to bless themselves, I guess. And really that's the point, I think, of thou shalt not covet. Several things you can think of. One is at the beginning of coveting, there is dissatisfaction. At the beginning, there's the dissatisfied heart. And so if you're not going to be tempted toward covetousness, you're going to be called to be satisfied. To live where you are, with what you have, with the people you have, in the situation you are, and trust that in that situation God is blessing you. And you can survive in that. You can survive in that. That this is peace. There is something embedded in our American scene that is consumer driven. We're consumer driven. And a part of being consumers and being driven is that in advertising there is the promotion of continual discontent. And that can take place in your kitchen, looking at your pantry. It can take place in your parking lot, looking at your car. It can take place in your church, looking at your church compared to some other church. You can live in discontent. A bunch of preachers getting together and asking those questions. What's your budget? How many do you have? All that. And trying to figure out what my level of embarrassment and discontent should be over what I have. The notion of seeking the kingdom, the notion of not worrying about tomorrow, the notion of being at peace and satisfied and joyful where you are with what you have and who you have and your influence is a remarkable gift and something we're free to do in Christ. When there is discontent and God doesn't seem to answer our hunger, then often we're tempted to take matters into our own hands. I'm not sure exactly how David made his appeal to Bathsheba for her attention. He could have ordered, he could have done a lot of things. But at some point, he decided that whatever pleasures he thought he should have, he probably felt awkward about praying to God for Bathsheba. Probably felt awkward about that. And so he acted on his own in remarkably inappropriate ways. And so being in discontent can open up our hearts to great temptations. James says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from desires that battle within you? You desire, but you don't have, so you kill. You covet, but you can't get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You don't have because you don't ask God. When you ask, you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you can spend what you get on your pleasures." And because there's dissatisfaction, then there is taking matters into our own hands and manipulating and tilting the world ourselves for our own advantage. I've even been in Bible faculties, frankly, where there were some offices and some that were good and some offices not so good and some advantages for these people and some advantages for that. There are travel budgets and research budgets and all kinds of things that people could want and sometimes what causes fights and quarrels among you. Even when the degrees on the wall are somewhat holy. And if there is inattention to satisfaction and peace and shalom in our hearts, whatever, and if we turn to our own devices, then in the Old Testament, and you assume in the New and now, the temptation is to turn to the gods who will bless your false desires. I think having the living God is pretty hard. I think having this Jehovah who doesn't want you to make anything in his image is pretty hard, because he's pretty serious. He's pretty serious about having your heart. He's pretty serious about having your behavior. He wants you to love him and love your neighbor. And part of loving your neighbor is not stealing his boat or his wife. And so the tendency is for us to demote God out of the place of power and control, and to have some other kind of more pleasant deity. The idols in the Old Testament didn't particularly care if you stole somebody else's wife. They didn't particularly care if you stole somebody else's servant. They didn't particularly care. And for that reason, idols, false gods, even the contemporary idolatries are much more forgiving about our attempts to get what we want. So if you hear you shall not covet your neighbor's stuff, if a part of loving your neighbor is not wanting to take their stuff, then we are going to be willing to serve the true and living God with his expectations and his grace when we fail those expectations, but with those expectations. And we are going to be guarding our heart so that we don't begin the strategies in our heart to get us what we shouldn't want but do. And having given up the false gods and the false ways, we might work our way back past our discontent to peace. To peace in our hearts. To peace with our bank accounts. To peace with our husbands and our wives. To peace with our stuff. And we might be like the image in the Psalms of the weaned child in the lap of its mother. Full, happy, not wanting anything but the companionship of God. Blessed are those who don't covet.